Coming up next from the grassy knoll, a terrifying look into the Orwellian world of brainwashing, disinformation, and ultimately control over you.
Warning, warning, warning. Your brain is about to engage. Open your ears, close your mouth, and open your mind. Ladies and gentlemen, Vyzygoth's Grassy Knoll.
All right, welcome again to another segment of the Grassy Knoll. This is being recorded on the best Saturday in the entire year, which is Thanksgiving Day Saturday. And with us is Sandra Uttley. She's been on before. She is the author of Dunblane Unburied. She's on to talk about further revelations that she's coming up with, which is very interesting to watch unfold, and also a number of other items, of course, also with the way life's been since the last time she was on. So without wasting any more time, let's get right down to it. Sandra, thanks for coming back to the show.
Thank you, Keith, for inviting me back.
All right. We were thinking about doing this for some time, and the time has now come. I'm assuming that this show is going to air, folks, on December 6th, but when you're listening to this, it'll be December 6th. So, at any rate, enough levity. Do me a favor. Although your first interview is still on my audio archives, and people can go and listen to more of the nuts and bolts about what took place there, would you just touch upon what the official record is on what took place on that March day in 1996?
Yes, as I said last time I was on, it was 10 years ago in March of this year. It was on the 13th of March 1996. A gunman walked into a primary school in Dunblane in Scotland and fired at a class full of 5-year-old children, and 16 children were killed and their teacher, and 12 children were injured, and 3 teachers were injured. Definitely Britain's worst mass murder. And subsequently there was an inquiry, and there was a cover-up of the truth at the inquiry, and I can say that quite emphatically. I did refer to certain aspects of that the last time I was on, and the documents that I have, and I'm hoping that I can talk about that in more detail this time.
Well, the official story also said we had our usual lone gunman.
Yes, he was portrayed, Thomas Hamilton, the man who was said to have committed the massacre, was portrayed as a loner. And again, as I referred to last time, in some respects he was, because he was an oddball. He lived a very unusual, strange life. As a paedophile and as a supplier of child pornography, he obviously wasn't really in the mainstream, but he did have a lot of acquaintances, a lot of men, wealthy men, visiting him regularly, and he did have contact with quite a few people, not just in that world, but in the shooting world as well. So he was connected to a lot of people, but he was portrayed as a loner, which seems to be the sort of formula that we now understand around these massacres, which starts to look just a bit too convenient.
Well, what's interesting also about what you said, and if folks are wondering about this pedophilia thing, what you found the neighbors were telling you about Hamilton's behavior or what was going on in and around his flat was that these men in suits were coming to his house all the time. And now this makes sense, I think you told me, when you understand this was in the pre-internet a porn situation. Is that right?
Yes. I mean, I think that we do forget about the pre-internet era. You know, everything was very different then, and they had to work in very different ways. I mean, I couldn't imagine that you'd have a supplier now in the sort of situation that Thomas Hamilton was in, where, you had people regularly visiting the house. I mean, it's all downloading this, that, and the other now.
Mm-hmm.
So until the massacre happened, I mean, even though this strange behaviour was going on, I mean, his neighbours, I mean, they told me that they would often look out and see yet another big flashy car outside his house and go, oh, that'll be somebody visiting Tommy. But, there weren't any prosecutions against him.
Mm-hmm.
So the neighbours would think, well, it's just somebody visiting Tommy, as everybody always called him. I mean, it was obviously once the massacre had happened and Thomas Hamilton's name was linked with that we became really aware of the kind of seedy life he'd been living for the previous 20 years.
Well, I'm unaware of what things were like, obviously, in the UK with regard to classifying and keeping track, as they do now here in the United States, which may not have been the case in 1996 here either, I'm not sure. But his pedophilia, was that uncovered, and was he under any kind of probation or anything like that?
Right, as far back as 1974, he was ousted from the Scouts movement as a Scout leader because of suspicions that he was a homosexual paedophile,
mm-hmm.
and also because of his neglectful treatment of the boys that he had in his care. So the Scout movement were aware that he wasn't he was an unsavoury character, I suppose you could put it.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't to be anywhere near boys. But he somehow found people in influential positions that allowed him to continue, to start up in the first place, running his own boys' clubs, under the guise of, I think I said last time it was gymnastics, and that was very much the case for probably the last 10 years. But I think when his club started out, he offered shooting for the boys,
mm-hmm.
shooting facilities, and also, football and the usual sports.
Mm-hmm.
But it gravitated more towards gymnastics as he managed to get his way into all the schools in central Scotland and access the gymnasiums and all the equipment that was available, even though he didn't have, the appropriate qualifications, which I talked about before. Sorry, you were saying that had there been any prosecutions?
Right. There weren't any.
There were police officers who tried to bring prosecutions against Thomas Hamilton. There was a DS, Paul Hughes, in 1991, wrote a very damning report on Thomas Hamilton with 10 possible charges that could have been brought against Hamilton with regard to his dealings with boys. As I told you the last time I was on, he took these boys away to a remote island on Loch Lomond and put them into little swimming trunks, and then he would sort of create these little films that he made, like on the basis of the Lord of the Flies, and would have these boys, like having to lie down in freezing cold water in the swimming trunks and filming them. I mean, this was obviously not just for his own use.
Right, and that also might explain why he never was prosecuted.
But, yeah, there were junior police officers who knew that there was somebody, more than one person, I think, in Central Scotland Police protecting Thomas Hamilton. And you actually have a situation around about the early 1990s where one police officer actually ran round to the Procurator Fiscal's office with a report on Hamilton to try and bypass, the senior management in Central Scotland Police. But then this is where the links with the Scottish judiciary come in, because none of the Procurators Fiscal brought any charges against Hamilton. I mean, even a simple charge of breach of the peace could have been brought against him. And if he'd been prosecuted on those grounds alone, he would have lost his firearms licence. And we have to remember this is where it all leads back to. Why did he have a firearms licence? How was he ever allowed to? How did this man ever get to 1996 as a legal gun owner? And so there were clearly a lot of favours being done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it would... let me ask you something. In 1996, was Thatcher still Prime Minister?
By then it was John Major.
Okay.
John Major came up to visit us in Dunblane on one of those visits, after a big state tragedy.
Mm-hmm.
And Thomas Hamilton's MP, who was also my MP, obviously, because I lived in the area, was Michael Forsyth. And Michael Forsyth was Secretary of State for Scotland and very much a close friend of Margaret Thatcher. I think the influence of Michael Forsyth in the lead-up to the massacre and the handling of it subsequently cannot be underestimated. I obviously don't think I should say too much more than that.
Okay.
But there is a little bit in the book about the changes in legislation Michael Forsyth was trying to bring in about the care of children that would have suited Thomas Hamilton down to the ground, changing it so that there didn't have to be any vetting of any adult looking after children. They were going to change it from 6 days to 60 days. Well, given that Hamilton took these boys away to this remote island, as I say, on Loch Lomond, for up to 8 weeks every summer, this would have suited him perfectly. Because Hamilton he kept himself on the right side of the law all the time. Sometimes, the legislation was continually changing. It was either dealing with children under 8 or children over 8, which was obviously an arbitrary cut-off point. Because how do you decide at what age a child should be granted more protection?
Right.
You see the same problem about the legal age of consent. There's a police officer here in Britain that's saying that men who target children who are sort of between the ages of about 13 and 16 shouldn't be classed as paedophiles, and that the term paedophilia should just be reserved for prepubescent children. Now, I can see where he's coming from by saying that, but the point I'm making is it is an arbitrary cut-off point where we decide what is paedophilia, what is abuse. All children are, deserving of protection. And Hamilton was just quite clearly playing with the law. And there is evidence, as I say, that Michael Heseltine, who was the Deputy Prime Minister, and Michael Forsyth, who was the Secretary of State for Scotland, who were both very much closely allied with Margaret Thatcher, were trying to bring in a change in the legislation which was described at the time. It was still on the cards at the time of the Dunblane massacre, and it was described as being a molester's charter. And of course, after Dunblane happened and all the scandal about Thomas Hamilton's background came out, it was dropped, it had to be. But everybody's forgotten about that. I just happen to have a copy of all the press cuttings from the immediate aftermath of the Dunblane massacre, which most people wouldn't have. And in fact, most newspaper archives don't even seem to go back as far as 1996, which seems ridiculous. And you go back and you look and you think, gosh, we were told so much of the truth about the whole political situation and about Thomas Hamilton in those first few weeks. And then, of course, there was a curb put on reporting when the inquiry was called. The Lord Cullen declared that there had to be no media reporting around any of the witnesses to do with the massacre, or anybody that had any information on Thomas Hamilton. And then the inquiry happened, and that became the official version of events. And then, of course, the media, apart from revisiting Dunblane around the anti-gun issue, they just don't revisit the subject at all.
Before we go any further, too, you said you kept the clippings. Some folks might not know why there was an attachment, so to speak, to the event. Anybody could obviously have their heartstrings absolutely destroyed because of the nature of this heinous act. So that anybody can understand. But you actually took up this I guess, crusade in a certain extent, because occupationally you had somewhat of an involvement with what took place that day.
Well, I think my involvement is threefold. Not only had I been a Dunblane resident for, a long time, nearly 2 decades, and I can't stress this enough, it's a quiet little backwater. It's a place, where as they always say, nothing ever happens. A dull place, real suburbia. And So the shock from that alone, even if there hadn't been the other two factors, one that I was working in the ambulance service at the time, and I relieved the first crew who were called to the scene, and so I witnessed firsthand, the trauma that they experienced, and they told me quite graphically what they had seen and what they had dealt with. And then there's also the fact that I started a relationship a few months after the massacre with Mick North, whose daughter was killed in the massacre.
Right.
And, not only had this relationship with him, but then when the relationship ended, continued working for him and providing him with support for the next 7 years. I mean, I left Dunblane 3 years ago, and I feel that it very much, impinged on my whole life once that massacre had happened. So, I mean, I was going to say maybe I would have got involved as a sort of passionate crusader type person anyway, but I don't think I would have done, because what led me into campaigning for the truth, and I did talk about this when I was on in October, was finding these original documents from the inquiry and studying them and realizing that, well, we weren't told the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose at that point you can either then just put the lid back on the box and say, oh, I didn't see that.
Right.
But that isn't me. That's not the way I can approach life. Maybe it would have been better for me, though, if I had, given what I've been through over the last 4 years, and particularly since I came on and talked to you the last time, because since I was on the last time, my website was hacked into, totally wiped out and destroyed. I had feared this was going to happen, and I had actually been making inquiries about getting my website located outside of Britain and perhaps in the States, where I think you have more sort of freedom of speech laws that protect you. But of course, my enemies here didn't even bother going through any kind of legal process. Quite clearly, somebody was paid to go in and did a very professional job. Literally wiped out 7 months of my work, documenting all my research. So I'm a bit worried. Before we started this interview, I checked to see if my new website is still there. And if it's not there by the end of this interview, it's your fault.
Okay. Well, let's talk about that, too, and also about how folks can get their hands on that book. Now, the website is still www.dunblaneunburied.tk. Is that correct?
.tk now, yeah, instead of .co.uk.
Okay. So it's www.dunblaneunburied.tk, and you spell Dunblane, folks, D-U-N-B-L-A-N-E. And now, are you still offering that book on the website?
Yes, the book's still available, but, I mean, that information is all on the new website, so I don't think I need to go over all that again, do I?
No, that's okay. As long as they know where they can hit it, that's fine.
Yeah, if anybody was interested, they can just look at the website and get the details.
Mm-hmm. That's Dunblane Unburied, and you finished that project when?
In March this year.
This year, right.
Yeah, that was my attempt at trying to bring an end to my involvement, because it has been so incredibly stressful. People don't want you to talk about it. I mean, and the website hacking is really only the latest in a long campaign of people trying to stop me doing this. I mean, there's a media silence on the subject, and that's why I set up the website, because to me, it's such a gross insult against humanity that the real truth behind the murders of so many small children, that the media just won't even talk about it. I mean, there has to be some kind of de-notice on this, because in January of this year, I sent out a press release to every single British newspaper after having got a copy of the statement of an off-duty police officer who was present in Dunblane Primary School that morning, who was clearly never part of the script and had to be written out of the whole story. And through several years of my own private inquiries, I managed eventually to get a copy of his statement through Freedom of Information, from Central Scotland Police. But they didn't hand this over willingly. I mean, they fobbed me off time and time again, with, you'll find this, 2 statements of off-duty police officers available at the National Archives of Scotland. And I said, well, I'm sure the one I particularly want isn't there. I particularly want the statement of the man who walked into the gym immediately after the massacre finished. And eventually I did get a copy of this. And fortunately for me, because I'd lived in Dunblane and I had made my own inquiries when I was still living there, I had a name in the back of my head of who this man might be. I'd been told by just a dog-walking friend who was a policeman, and I'd said to him just casually one day, my ambulance service colleagues tell me that there was an off-duty police officer present when they got there, because they were the first ambulance crew there. And my colleagues told me that they were met by this man who said he was an off-duty cop. And he just said to me, oh, yes, that was Grant McCutcheon. And I just stored that name in the back of my head, and I thought, well, one day this might be useful. And when I got a copy of his statement, it was quite clear to me why they'd hidden his statement, because his evidence directly contradicts the evidence given by the janitor and by the scene of crime officer, who didn't arrive at the school till 11:30 in the morning, and the incident had happened at 9:30 in the morning.
Well, how do they differ? What did the janitor say he found, and what did the off-duty officer state?
The off-duty police officers, it really is extremely revealing. I mean, we were told by the scene of crime officer that Hamilton had 4 holsters round his waist, and there were 4 guns. The off-duty police officer, Grant McCutcheon, said there was just 1 holster. You have to remember, he would have given his statement not aware that the scene of crime officer was going to come in and say something different. So he was told what he saw, and it's actually a very detailed statement. I mean, it's about 14, 15 pages long. I mean, because he gives so much detail about everybody he passed while he was in the school dropping off his child at nursery. As I say, he was on a day off from his work as a police officer. And he gives so much detail of everybody he passed as he was running to the gym that you can't really doubt him. And actually, I'd since spoken to the man, so I don't doubt him at all. But he said, yes, there was 1 holster, there was only 2 guns, and both the guns were pistols. There was no revolver present on the scene. And yet we were told that Hamilton killed himself with a Smith & Wesson revolver. So you start to understand why they had to spirit this statement away. And the existence of this off-duty police officer was just completely airbrushed out. Because he also said that Hamilton was wearing a black boiler suit. And in the final report that's written by Lord Cullen, by then Thomas Hamilton's wearing black corduroy trousers. And even the professor who did the post-mortem on Thomas Hamilton admitted that Hamilton had been partially unclothed at the locus, which shouldn't have happened.
Now, a boiler suit is a jumpsuit, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, 1 piece? Okay.
Yeah, I suppose the sort of thing that you would, if you were going on some kind of SAS mission or something. I mean, it's strange that he was wearing a boiler suit.
Okay.
But it's strange. It's even more strange that his clothing was changed. And also, when the off-duty police officer walked in, I mean, I did refer the last time I was on to there being the evidence of a student teacher who said he saw Hamilton kill himself. But this student teacher, David Scott, he was called, was said to have been in an art class looking down into the gym when he saw Hamilton commit suicide. And I think I did say when I was on last that his evidence is very ambiguous. I mean, not least because he didn't give evidence actually at the inquiry. His evidence was read out by the senior investigating officer. And a lot of it just doesn't ring true. And when I wrote to Grant McCutcheon, I found out there was 1 Grant McCutcheon in Scotland. And after I'd got a copy of the statement of this off-duty police officer, and I say his name wasn't in the statement, it had been redacted out. So I just wrote to him saying, I just wonder if you are the police officer that was present in the gym. And I couldn't believe it when he actually phoned me up a few days later, which was just in the beginning of this year. And we went over a lot of things he'd said in his statement, and I asked him, were you surprised then that you weren't called to give evidence at the inquiry? And he said, well, yes. But he said, I assumed that my evidence was just somebody else was giving similar evidence. He was actually only a probationer. He was just finished his first probation year. But when I said, well, are you absolutely emphatic now, even after 10 years, that you definitely did not see a revolver present on the scene? He said, absolutely. He said, I'm ex-RAF. He said, we had firearms training. He said, I know the difference between a pistol and a revolver. So you start to understand why we were never meant to know about this man. And we would have never have known about this man. I mean, as I say, it was my ambulance colleague, Alison Irvin. She told me we were met at the school by this man who said he was an off-duty police officer. And I would say for a good 3 years, I probably actually thought this man might have been the assassin, the one who killed Thomas Hamilton. Having now spoken to the man, of course, realised his part in it was completely different. As in, he walked into a situation he wasn't meant to have walked into. And I think I lost the sort of thread there a bit. But when he was speaking to me, he said that David Scott, student teacher, who was in this art class when he saw Hamilton commit suicide, apparently David Scott was in the gym. Now, Hamilton can only have been shot, less than a minute before Grant McCutcheon walked in, because his body was still, there was heavy breathing, there was gurgling. He wasn't, dead.
He wasn't dead, right.
What was David Scott doing in there? And then when he walked in, Grant McCutcheon, the off-duty police officer, the janitor, John Curry, was at the side of Hamilton's body, apparently removing a gun from Hamilton's hand.
How helpful.
Yes. And when Grant McCutcheon walked in, apparently he said to the janitor, leave the gun alone. And the janitor got up and walked towards him and just said, I was, just removing it for safety or something. This man that's lying there near death. You have to wonder, what was the janitor doing, messing about with this gun in Hamilton's hand? And then the other thing is, in the janitor's witness statement, he says it was a Dirty Harry-style revolver that he was removing from Hamilton's hand.
A .44 revolver, right?
Yeah, well, we were told that Hamilton committed suicide using a Smith & Wesson revolver. Right. But, as I say, the off-duty police officer, who was clearly never meant to have been there, gave, such contradictory evidence. And if this had been a proper inquiry, and I think I said, quite a few times in the last interview that it obviously wasn't a proper inquiry. It was a staged cover-up. It was a whitewash.
And we'll talk about how that also is a common thread through some other incidents, both here in Australia. Here I'm talking about the United States, what you encountered out in the UK, and also what took place in Australia. But as we draw in this first half hour to a close, do you know anything about the janitor, per se? Is he still at the school? Did he leave shortly after? Was he there very long before this incident took place? Anything like that?
Well, all I know that we were told he was 33 years old, but Grant McCutcheon, which I thought was young for a janitor, but janitors tend to be, sort of elderly, retired chaps. And when I said to Grant McCutcheon that the janitor was only 33, he said, he looked much older than that. No, he's disappeared.
Okay.
His name was John Curry. I have tried to locate him, and it's a difficult name. That's a pretty common name anyway. I only managed to find David Scott, the student teacher, because one of the media reports I read about him gave a middle name, David Duke Scott. Okay. And as a result, I managed to track him down, but he's not for speaking at all. He was contacted as well by a journalist that did an article about my research about 3 years ago, and he threatened the newspaper with legal action. Extremely defensive.
Well, that's a good tack also, and we're not necessarily intimating anything about him, but to be that aggressive, not a bad idea perhaps. And the reason I'm saying it, and we're coming to a close right now, folks, and we're going to get into more in the second half hour, but in a cover-up situation, it would be helpful, and of course it looks as if one is innocent, but we're not saying anything particular about that individual. However, when we come back in the second half hour, if there was a cover-up, and you're quite sure there was, what was the reason and who might have been involved and who were the ones that were being protected. And we'll do that in the second half hour. You're listening to The Grassy Knoll. We have with us Sandra Uttley. She is the author of Dunblane Unburied. And we'll be back in about 60 seconds.
This is the program your mother warned you about. Vyzygoth's Grassy Knoll continues.
Welcome back to the second half hour of The Grassy Knoll. We have with us Sandra Uttley. She is the author of Dunblane Unburied. She took a look at a very horrible incident that took place in March 1996 in the Scottish town of Dunblane. And of course, we said that we have a full hour devoted to most of the mechanics, if you will, of that incident. And it's up in my archived audio on Vyzygoth.com in the audio section, of course. Now, quite a few things, though, Sandra. As you were talking about a number of items at the end of the first half hour. What I want to know, and I've got some notes from as you spoke, and I want to hit these points real quick just so we can get them in. The bit about the shooter being involved in some kind of boys' clubs and stuff like that. See, in the United States, that doesn't make all that much sense in a way, because usually you might work for the recreation department for the town. You might be in the education system as a gym teacher or whatever. Yes, there are amateur sports teams outside of school where there are volunteer coaches. What was this guy's, title? I mean, how did he set himself up as whatever he was with the kids?
Very good question. I mean, it is mind-boggling that he was put in such a position of authority with these young children. I mean, he'd gone from school at the age of 15 to work in the architects department, I think, of the local council. I don't think he stayed there very long, and then he started up his own wood shop. And I think then he went briefly into kitchens. But by the time he was 21, early 20s, I mean, his main interest was being with boys, and he started, as they tried to get into the Scout movement, but he was ousted by the Scouts in 1974. And then how this happened. How he managed to get to run clubs in school gymnasiums in so many schools throughout central Scotland is just incredible. I mean, he was supported, but there's no doubt about this, by his local councillor, Robert Ball. When I spoke last time about Hamilton not having the appropriate gymnastic qualifications, that he only had this grade 5 women's artistic award, which didn't qualify him to coach boys. I mean, God knows what he had to do to gain that qualification. I mean, it sort of doesn't bear thinking about, Hamilton in a leotard or something. He was not a qualified gymnastics teacher. So, but of course, because he ran his clubs in school, when he put his leaflets out, and he worked hard at promoting himself. I mean, he went round, probably every house in Dunblane, and if he did it in Dunblane, you can be sure he did it in every other place in the area, putting leaflets through, promoting his clubs. And he would often put the names of people who he obviously considered supported him on these letters, and that included his MP, Michael Forsyth, and his local councillor, Robert Ball, and the police inspector, Michael Mill. Whether he was taking liberties, I mean, in some respects you could just put it down to that he was taking liberties, but something must have given him the idea that he was supported, because to continually get these lets of these school gyms right up until the very end, March 1996. somebody was pulling strings for him, and because he just was totally not the sort of person who should have been doing this. As you say, when we hear about an exposure of a paedophile now, as you say, they're often found to be a care worker, or they've been in some kind of position where they've got access to children. But he was completely outside the mainstream.
Now, you had mentioned, I believe, the last time out, that he had been in that gymnasium because of this pursuit of his. Do you know that his presence there would not have raised a flag because he might have been somewhat familiar looking or known to the personnel at the school?
Well, we don't even know how the gunman entered the school or which entrance he went through.
All right.
I mean, the story we're told is that nobody did see the gunman enter the school.
All right, so Hamilton wasn't identified. Nobody eyeballed him. It was after the fact that it was discovered. It was he that was... Yeah.
Yeah, we were told that he had entered the school. Lord Cullen in his report says that Hamilton, because this is who we've been told the gunman was, entered the school by the boys' toilets on such and such a corridor. One of my Freedom of Information requests, I asked if fingerprints had been taken, to ascertain for certain. And I was told that no fingerprinting was done at all. Well, how did Lord Cullen know for certain then that Hamilton entered the school through this door
right.
of the boys' toilets? Because in the media reports in the first few days, we were actually told lots of different stories. That he had been apprehended, that he'd started firing in the playground before he went into the school, and that he went in the main entrance. I mean, I'm sure in the confusion in the first few days, there would have been some false reporting. Journalists would have been grabbing onto whatever they could get. But I've not read anything that tells us definitely that the gunman or Thomas Hamilton was seen entering the school or was identified by anybody before arriving at that gymnasium.
Let's say this too, and again, all of this is in Sandra's book, Dunblane Unburied. I want to get this straight. As far as politicians having a proclivity towards tawdry conduct, mainly because they think they're above the law, and oftentimes they're right, we could see a situation here where there was some kind of obviously salacious connection between the shooter, and I keep forgetting his name. It's Thomas. It's Hamilton. I want to say Hutchinson. Okay, between Hamilton and perhaps men in suits and such. Now here in the United States, we had Franklin Cover-Up, written by state Nebraska Senator John DeCamp, about a sex slave ring that was going on with young people, both male, female. Some of them coming from Boys Town. In Nebraska, and then being pipelined to parties not only in Nebraska, but out into Bohemian Grove, which is nefarious for another whole set of reasons, to include pedophilia, homosexuality, underage sex and such, with notables not only from the United States, but around the world. Nobody ever hears much about this unless you go looking for it. It's not unusual, as you cite, all the things that didn't happen in this particular case. I mean, not only from him being set up to be having this access to children, which he shouldn't have had, and then also having these suits around, and then all of a sudden, perhaps, and this is where I think you're going, I'm going to let you pick it up, that Thomas Hamilton was a patsy that day, and probably the person who was going to get eliminated because of whatever risk he might present to people who could obviously have their careers destroyed. Now, that's a big extrapolation on my part. But you pick it up from there, because have you come to the idea since you wrote the book, or even at the end of writing the book, that Hamilton might, in fact, have been, let's face it, a patsy in a larger conspiracy?
Well, I haven't any doubt about that now at all. It's almost like the final bits of the jigsaw have been put together for me. As you were asking about how did he get all this access to children when, what was his official title, what was his job. This was an unemployed man who had no qualifications at all. I also mentioned to you briefly when I talked to you earlier that there is another Dunblane website. It's called Dunblane Abandoned. And there's a lot of really interesting information on that website. about Thomas Hamilton's links with another school in Dunblane, which is called Queen Victoria School. It's a private boarding school for the sons of servicemen. I mean, it was just boys at the school up until 1996, and I think the girls now go to the school. And it's very much isolated on the edge of Dunblane. So this is a military establishment. And when the massacre happened, I must admit, my first thought was it had to have been there, that this had to have been some kind of military attack. But the point is, Thomas Hamilton had a lot of connections with that school. And there have been a lot of allegations of abuse of boys at that school. And then you look at the whole list of the Board of Governors for the Queen Victoria School, and it includes, like, the Secretary of State of Scotland, whoever the Secretary of State of Scotland is at the time, and then it was Michael Forsyth, Thomas Hamilton's MP. I mean, the connections between all the different people that have to have played some part in the protection of Thomas Hamilton for all those years, and his elimination.
Now, Hamilton, it was not somebody, yes, he did have a gun permit, you said, is that correct?
Yes, he did.
All right, but this is not somebody who we know went out shooting all the time and was a marksman of any particular caliber. Now, we are to believe that he went ahead then, and in a brief amount of time. Now here's where I got to ask you. You said that the children were disabled before they were executed with a shot to the head. Mm-hmm. When they were disabled, how were they disabled? Shot?
Yes.
And put down?
Yes.
All right, so this guy actually...
once they've been shot, they would all fallen to the ground.
Yeah, and be in shock and not going. So This guy actually shot 17 people 2 times around.
Well, some of the children had as many as 7 gunshot injuries. I mean, the girl I was talking about when I was last on, Mary, who was taken to the hospital that had died en route, she just had the 1 gunshot wound to her head. But nearly all the children had several gunshot injuries.
And what span of time was this shooting supposed to...
We were told it was over within 3 minutes.
And the thing is, we don't know... Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Well, as you say, it just, to me, it's like a skilled marksman.
Or more than one, or,
I think there would have been some reference in some of the statements I've read to more, if there'd been more than one, man involved. But I just believe there was the one.
And to attribute this kind of killing, and I remember, folks don't know what it's like. I mean, if you're not somebody who I guess is a hardened a war veteran, and even in that situation, obviously, your adrenaline's pumping. But an individual who's not given to this kind of activity usually, to have been that, I hate to use the word prolific, in a brief amount of time is really it does stretch the imagination.
Well, that's what plagued me, I think, for all the years since it's happened, is that I tried to come up with some kind of psychological explanation for why Hamilton did this. I didn't believe the story, because I did believe up until recently that Hamilton had committed the massacre. And I tried to come up with some kind of psychological reason. I mean, we were told by Lord Cullen that Hamilton's intention had been to kill everybody in the school. This was a school full of over 700 pupils. And we were told this because they obviously placed a big case of ammunition there that just so happened to have enough, ammo to kill everybody. And I never believed that story. And in fact, there isn't even a single witness that refers to the gunman walking into the gym carrying this large, heavy case and then putting it down and then starting firing.
Right.
I mean, it was clearly placed there later. So when in all the years that I've been involved in this, I've been trying to come up with some kind of what could have happened. Did Hamilton... for a long time, I believed that Hamilton had set off to kill the head teacher. And because he obviously wanted to go... We were told, this is what we were told, that he had tried to time it, that he got there when the assembly was on. And when he got there, the assembly had finished, and there was nobody in the assembly hall. And all I could put down to what happened then was that maybe Hamilton was looking to exit the school and knew that there was a fire exit off the gym. And then, of course, when he got to the gym, there was his class in there. And I thought, well, maybe it was rage or panic that caused this massacre to happen. Because I was trying to, I've just tried so hard to work it out. I think that's one thing that has kept me going on searching for explanations. And I would welcome anybody else, putting forward their theories about all the lies we were told about the sequence of events on the morning. But nobody else, all people want to do is try to just discredit me, even though I will only talk about hard, factual evidence. They just seem to want to discredit my theories. And I admit that they're theories. When I was on the last time, I spoke about how I thought that the reason why they'd altered all the CCTV times was because I believed that Hamilton was maybe meeting with somebody. And that explains the detour as well, that he didn't set off directly to Dunblane. And, since I was on the last show, somebody came onto my website and just wanted to try and destroy everything I'd said on the last interview. But it was like saying, well, you can't possibly come up with this theory. Well, actually, I'm allowed to come up with theories. If we were not told the truth, if times were altered, if the direction that the van was seen leaving the roundabout was altered, then I'm sorry, but as a researcher into this, I can come up with a theory. And if anybody else wants to come up with an alternative theory, good, fine. But nobody does. They just say, some of the stuff that some of these guys that come onto my website, maybe he went to buy a newspaper. Well, if Hamilton has set off 45 minutes earlier, just to go and buy a newspaper, I think the police would have found that out in their investigation. So I haven't had anybody come up with any sort of strong arguments against that hard factual evidence that I put forward. Because they know they can't, because once I've made it quite clear, I stated quite clearly when I was on last time where I got these documents. So their authenticity cannot be doubted. If I was somebody that was just going by hearsay or newspaper reports, I could see, there would be grounds for doubt.
Well, there's one other thing you touched upon. Well, actually, you didn't touch upon it. You talked about it to a certain depth last time around. I'll ask you to touch upon it again, and that is what I found curious was you said the location of several bullets at the base of the gym wall. That was the wall that the entrance doors were that were in.
Yes, the parents of a girl who was in the gym, Victoria Porteous, who was uninjured. She didn't receive any gunshot injury. There were only 3 girls that survived the attack on that class. 2 girls were really quite critically injured, and they're both disabled. But Victoria Porteous lay down and, pretended to be dead. Remarkable survival instincts in a child that age, and obviously observed an awful lot of what was going on. And I got a copy of her parents' statement that they had given to their solicitor in preparation for the Dunblane inquiry. And they said that they'd noticed that in every wall of the gym there were a lot of bullet holes. But in this particular wall where Hamilton's body was found, there were just 2 bullet holes, 6 inches from the ground and 2 inches apart. And actually, I've now got the scene of crime diagrams, and that is confirmed. These 2 bullet holes are there. And I made a Freedom of Information request. Gosh, I never give up, do I? Asking, for clarification of the bullets.
Why is that a suspicious thing?
Because we were told by the scene of crime officer that the bullets that exited Hamilton's head came out of the top of his head. But the pathologist who did the post-mortem said the bullet exited from behind his left ear. If Hamilton too was disabled, like the children were, and was, then the final shots were administered while he was on the ground, then if there was an exit wound from the top of his head and an exit wound from behind his left ear, it would fit with the parents obviously had some kind of suspicion about this, but they voiced it in their statement.
Mm-hmm.
And it would fit with these, the 2 inches apart. If you think of a skull,
mm-hmm.
That's what arouses my suspicion. And in the context of everything else the parents said in their statement, that the person who fired at Hamilton, and the name Hamilton's left in, I said this the last time I was on, that's probably the one that should have been blanked out. Because they said someone fired into the bottom end of the gym where Hamilton entered the gym. And as I also said the last time, so much of the statements that these parents made has been blanked out.
All right.
So it is hard to make sense of, but it's been blanked out for a reason. They haven't just put a felt tip pen through names, but they've clearly left that one. And I must admit, for a long time I couldn't work out what this meant. He fired into the bottom end of the gym where Hamilton entered the gym. But then if you have finally formed the opinion that Hamilton was a patsy, that he was set up that day and he was always going to take the blame for the massacre, well, it all starts to piece together. And you go back and you read over things and you think, oh my goodness, this was staring me in the face all along.
Mm-hmm.
But it just hadn't simply occurred to me, because right at the outset I did consider MI5 involvement in Dunblane, because there was such a blanket ban on coverage of those of us who were trying to,
mm-hmm.
expose the truth. And it was put to me, well, if it's MI5 involvement, you've not got a chance. And then I actually removed that thought from my head, and I thought, no, this is not a government-orchestrated massacre. This is something that's gone very wrong in central Scotland. It's allowed Thomas Hamilton to get into this situation, that he walked into that school. But I've gone full circle, because now I strongly believe there's MI5 involvement, and that this was a government-orchestrated massacre, and that Thomas Hamilton was selected as a patsy probably a good couple of years beforehand.
Yeah, and I get. All right, let me state this then. Is this plausible? That obviously he was involved in a very tawdry enterprise that might have involved politicians or men in suits. We'll just say that, and that they gave. Or a rationale was given for why he would pop up at Dunblane if he has his axe to grind with somebody who works there. And then you have somebody, obviously, that is there to take him out. And I hate to say it, but then it's a horrible word, the collateral damage to children was just to make it look like a heinous act of a madman. Would that be correct?
Well, no, I think that it was part of an effort to change gun laws in Britain. The gun control movement have to be involved in this in some way. But ordinary individual murders of people, through the use of guns, doesn't create outrage against guns. The majority of ordinary murders are probably domestic.
Mm-hmm.
Women being killed by their partner, ex-partner. Now that doesn't bring the government to, a realization that guns are unsafe and that we should ban them. There needed to be some kind of outrage. And I know this is where it does seem to be stretching things, and people now maybe don't even want to listen to what I have to say anymore, and don't believe this is possible. But given even the resistance to the changing gun laws, even after a massacre of so many children, you can see that they couldn't have just brought legislation in. There would have always been resistance. So there had to have been a political lobby group behind this. And what convinces me more and more, you've had people on talking about Columbine, and talking about Port Arthur, and these quite clearly were staged massacres too.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you've got these are the three big massacres, and if they've all been staged, and there's so much evidence now, you've had people on that have studied so much material in depth about the Australian massacre and the Columbine massacre, and I don't doubt what they're saying. And none of us knew each other. We didn't all sort of just suddenly, conspire together and say, oh, well, let's come up with this theory that these big massacres are actually orchestrated and planned for a reason. I mean, it's hard to understand why the two boys were selected as the patsies of Columbine. I mean, Thomas Hamilton, a lot of people wanted rid of him. He had a lot of dirt on a lot of people. Martin Bryant with the Port Arthur massacre, you can see perhaps he was selected because apparently, very low IQ,
right,
easily manipulated. So if it hadn't been for the internet, I wouldn't have ever known anything about the background research going on about Port Arthur or about Columbine, and we would have all been isolated. So, and I'm not saying I'm in contact with all these other people. I've just been listening to your, radio programs, and I am just struck by how much manipulation has gone on to bring these massacres about, and then to cover up the truth afterwards.
Well,
there has to be a political lobby group involved in this.
The thing about gun control, the gun grabbers, I don't know why it doesn't penetrate them, or it does and they want to refuse to believe it, or they know it's a weak link in their argument. But, if there is gun confiscation, and I am a gun owner, if the bad guys know that nobody has anything, why do these people who want to grab guns think that the bad guys will play by the rules? In other words, I mean, you have a situation, if we were to take, let's say, Thomas Hamilton's supposed M.O., and he's a bad guy, and these guys will always have the guns. So then everybody else is defenseless, and these characters go on and on their merry way because they're not going to play by the rules. And, of course, it's good people that own guns that are not the problem, so you strip in the ones that aren't the problem for the ones that would always be a problem, whether you confiscate or not. Now, in Columbine, there might have been a bunch of other things going on there. It could have been, as I think Bill is laying out, very much a military operation, if you will, a gigantic psychological operation with obviously a body count and a lot of fallout. And he states quite clearly why that would be. At Port Arthur, again, you had intelligent people being killed as well. And what Zabel said about Columbine, and may have happened again even in Dunblane, is that you might have a black op group that goes in, and let's say that Klebold and Harris were involved without a doubt. They may not have known what they were completely involved in, though. And then you have a group go in to take care of the supposed perps, and then a group comes in to take care of those who took care of the perps. I mean, it seems to be running that way, and perhaps in Dunblane as well.
Well, yes, I mean, I listened to Bill Zabel, and he's talking about the teams and the clean-up teams and everything. And I think that you can see that that's what happened at Dunblane as well. I mean, the scene of crime officer, I mean, as I say, his evidence, which we were told was the official version, Hamilton having these 4 guns, 4 holsters, etc. He must have been part of the next team. I mean, I hadn't really, got that sort of terminology in my head. I mean, I knew that, they obviously moved the responsibility on to different people at different levels of the post-massacre business. And as I say, that's why I think we were never ever meant to know about the presence of this off-duty police officer. He was not part of the script.
That's right.
I mean, the shock that these people must have had when he walked in and then gave, as I say, such a detailed, graphic witness statement. I say, I've got it, and it's 14, 15 pages long. I mean, it completely exposes that we weren't told the truth.
Well, when was the last time you spoke to him?
He phoned me on January the 2nd of this year. I'd written to him on the 28th of December at the end of last year. I don't like Christmas, just like yourself, and I was busy sort of thinking, what can I do next on the campaign? And I wrote this letter to Grant McCutcheon, and he phoned me. I just couldn't believe it. I was gobsmacked, actually. And he was quite happy for me to go public with the fact that I'd found him, and that he was quite happy to speak out. and to stick by the statement he'd made 10 years ago. So I did go public with it. I put a statement out to the whole press, but I say they just completely ignored it. I mean, to me, this was the most sensational story.
Right.
And a witness that we'd never, ever even heard about.
By the way, is he still in law enforcement?
He moved from Central Scotland Police up to the north of Scotland the year after the massacre. So he's very much sort of... I'm sure that's why he phoned me. If he'd still been in Central Scotland, I don't think he would have done. He wouldn't have been allowed to.
Well, if he's still in law enforcement, I'm surprised somebody didn't, quote, talk to him.
I think he has been talked to now.
Okay.
As I say, my book came out in March, and I sent him a copy, and I thanked him for having contacted me and confirmed, so many details for me. But he's gone very quiet now.
All right, we're going to have to hold it there. We're up with our second half hour. We've had with us Sandra Uttley. She's written Dunblane Unburied, and there's more that's being, if you will, unearthed with the weeks and months that go by. Sandra, stay right there for a second, if you will, folks. This has been the Grassy Knoll. We thank you for listening, and we'll see you tomorrow.
This program is produced by Vyzygoth Incorporated. Any rebroadcast or use of this program without the express consent of Vyzygoth Incorporated is strictly encouraged. I'm Phil McCracken, the voice behind the voice, and thank you for listening.